Let's get some analysis now with Harold Tobin. He's a professor and director at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network and the Paros Endowed Chair in Seismology and Geohazards. He joins us now from Seattle in the United States. Really good to have you with us, Professor. In terms of these latest earthquakes, both measuring more than 7 in magnitude, how does that compare with recent earthquakes that have happened in other parts of the world?
Well, I think we really have to say that these are globally unusual sized earthquakes. We know, of course, we've seen some very large events in the past decade with some of the offshore ones and the tsunamis. But if you want to look for earthquakes in a continental area, highly populated region like this of a magnitude as much as 7.8, you have to go back much further in time. Really, in the US, for example, I think the only direct comparison you can make is to the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that devastated that city, and that's more than 100 years ago. It's actually quite unusual, especially to have the pair of 7.8 and 7.5 closely spaced in time on adjacent fault systems like this. I can't think of another example in many decades.
Yes, now, when earthquakes like this happen, the question of why we still can't predict the onset of earthquakes does come up. And despite the technological advancements in seismology, we can monitor them, we can certainly measure them. Why is it that the technology to predict them still eludes us?
Well, you're absolutely right. The technology does elude us. And while we have a pretty good sense today as seismologists of the regions that are most earthquake prone. And as you know well, the East Anatolian Fault as well as North Anatolian Fault have been identified as high hazard zones for many years. But the short-term ability to predict the onset of that earthquake still really absolutely does elude us. And I think the reasons are that once the fault has built up enough of the stress, the strain in the Earth's crust that can produce an earthquake, then it's a matter of a kind of a cascade of some place on the fault giving way, literally, to the friction, to all the powerful forces in the crust that are driving the two plates side by side. And then once that rupture begins, it can grow a little bit and stop as a relatively small earthquake. But if conditions are just right in some very complex way, deep in the earth inside the fault zone, then that rupture grows and grows, and it's sort of a runaway, almost chain reaction style process. So the literal physics of the earthquake certainly are part of the reason why it's very hard for us to know when a particular event will rupture and nucleate, as we say, the beginning of one. Having said that, I think that we're learning a lot with all of the sensors and the concentration of instruments that we can put in the earth, on the Earth's surface, and even down in the subsurface in boreholes. And perhaps we're learning enough from each of these large events to build up some sort of understanding that will show us new signal eventually and get us to that goal.
And Professor, we know these latest earthquakes that occurred on Monday struck one particular plate in the south of the country. We know Istanbul, Turkey's most populous city, lies on another plate to the north. Is there any correlation between the two? I guess the question is there reason to fear in Istanbul that perhaps the result of these earthquakes on Monday could perhaps trigger another seismic incident in Istanbul or thereabouts?
Yeah, well, this is a very challenging question to answer for sure. There's no doubt that the part of the North Anatolian Fault that is adjacent directly to Istanbul, runs under the Sea of Marmara, is a place that has the potential for a large future earthquake. The shaking from these events didn't directly trigger that to take place, so that's a good sign in the sense that it didn't immediately rupture as the waves literally passed by Istanbul from the earthquakes from a few days ago. It's probably too far away for a direct transfer of stress through the Earth's crust to do that. At the same time, we can say that strong shaking like this destabilizes faults in the world. And so for me, what I can only say, and I know that so many people are worried about this question, is that as before the earthquakes, Istanbul should understand and be prepared that a large earthquake is possible and take those steps to prioritize that preparation. As for whether it's more likely today than it was 5 days ago, it's really very hard to say from what we know seismologically. I can't say that it is, but I can't definitively tell you that it's not.
Hmm. And how can residents in earthquake-prone areas prepare for the onset of an earthquake, if such preparations can take place?
Yeah, yeah. Of course, the terrible thing about earthquakes is they do strike without short-term warning, and they wait, centuries in between events on a particular fault. I think the central portion of the East Anatolian Fault that we saw move in the 7.8 the other day had not had an earthquake since sometime in the year 1513, if I understand correctly, so 500 years ago. So that's the surprise that earthquakes generate. But that also means that for any given fault zone, the likelihood of an earthquake in the short term is always relatively low. It means, of course, an earthquake could, I hope not, but could strike, tomorrow. But an earthquake could also wait decades to even centuries before the next one happens. So what that means is that preparation should be seen as the long view. Make sure that those building codes are up to snuff, and also that older buildings are retrofitted to be stronger against the shaking. Make sure that individual families themselves can make sure they have a kit that's ready to go for when the power is out, the damage happens. A go kit won't help you if the building that you're in completely collapses, but for many of the people who are survivors, of course, it can make the difference between a little bit of comfort after the event and a much worse outcome. Um, those are the things that really can be done. I think that any government or region around the world can think about implementing earthquake early warning systems, which we have now on the west coast of the U.S., but it's quite new. And those systems don't predict the earthquake. What they do is they detect it as soon as the very beginning few seconds of the earthquake happen, and then can send out a broadcast warning to, let's say, mobile phone devices that give people anywhere from a few seconds in the worst case to many tens of seconds or a
Yes.
minute of preparation time. So those are steps that can be taken to improve, everybody's situation.
Okay, Professor Harold Tobin, we will have to leave it there, but thank you so much for sharing your analysis with us here on TRT World.